Most people measure wealth by what it buys. For Barbara Hutton, wealth was measured by what it took away. By the time she was a child, newspapers were already calling her the richest little girl in the world. Her name appeared in society columns long before she understood what privacy was. Photographers waited outside iron gates. Strangers speculated about her future as if it were public property. To the world, she was a fairy tale wrapped in silk and diamonds. But inside the mansion, there was no fairy tale. Barbara Hutton was born into the Woolworth fortune, a retail empire that had quietly reshaped modern consumer culture. The money was vast, almost abstract in scale. Trust funds layered on top of trust funds, estates that stretched farther than memory, a fortune designed to last generations. And yet, from the beginning, something essential was missing. Her mother died by suicide when Barbara was still a child, a death that was never properly spoken about, only absorbed. Her father, distant and emotionally absent, retreated into duty and appearances. What remained was money, caretakers, tutors, and silence. Endless silence. Inheritance came early for Barbara, not just financial inheritance, but emotional inheritance. The expectation to endure, to smile, to represent something larger than herself. She did not inherit guidance. She did not inherit protection. She inherited exposure. When she came of age, the world watched closely. Her debut was covered like a coronation. Jewels glittered under chandeliers. Society applauded as if welcoming a queen. But behind the spectacle, Barbara stood alone, untrained for autonomy, unprepared for the predators who circled quietly, patiently. Because extreme wealth does not repel danger. It attracts it. From the moment she inherited control of her fortune, Barbara Hutton became a target for lovers, for advisors, for husbands, for anyone who understood that affection could be monetized. And she, desperate for connection, believed that love might finally give her what money never could. It never did. This is not a story about a woman who lost her fortune. This is the story of a woman who was never taught how to keep herself. The Woolworth fortune was never meant to be personal. It was engineered to be permanent. Barbara Hutton was born into one of America's most quietly dominant dynasties, a family that did not rule through titles or politics, but through scale. Frank W. Woolworth had built his empire on a simple idea: sell cheap goods to everyone. In doing so, he created something far more powerful than luxury. He created dependence. Millions of ordinary people walked through Woolworth stores every day, and the money flowed upward, endlessly, predictably. By the time Barbara was born in 1912, that river of cash had already hardened into stone. Her lineage was not aristocratic in the European sense, but it carried its own rigid code. Appearances mattered. Silence mattered more. Emotion was considered a liability. The family did not raise children to feel. They raised them to represent. Barbara's father, Franklin Laws Hutton, married into the Woolworth fortune and became its public steward. He understood numbers, contracts, and reputation. What he did not understand, or perhaps did not prioritize, was how to raise a child inside a financial machine designed for adults. After Barbara's mother died, the dynasty closed ranks. There were no public scandals, no emotional reckoning. The tragedy was absorbed and buried beneath routine. Tutors replaced parents. Nannies replaced affection. Mansions replaced homes. From a distance, Barbara's childhood looked pristine. Private schools, European travel, language lessons, art collections. But inside that controlled elegance, she was learning a far more dangerous lesson: that love was transactional and attention only came when something was being given. The Woolworth dynasty had rules, though none were ever written down. You did not embarrass the family. You did not question authority. And you did not confuse personal desire with family interest. Barbara broke all three. She was sent to elite schools not to be educated, but to be refined. Yet she struggled socially, emotionally, and psychologically. Teachers described her as withdrawn, anxious, and desperate for approval. Classmates whispered about her fortune long before they knew her name. Even as a teenager, she learned that wealth erased privacy but did not guarantee belonging. Most old money families teach their heirs discipline first, generosity second. Barbara was taught neither. Her wealth was locked behind lawyers and trustees, but her emotional life was completely unguarded. She was surrounded by adults who managed her assets meticulously and ignored her vulnerability entirely. The dynasty believed money would stabilize her. Money would protect her. Money would smooth over whatever cracks appeared. But dynasties that survive understand one brutal truth. Money without control is not a shield. It is bait. As Barbara approached adulthood, the Woolworth fortune stood intact, immense, and globally admired. The family name still carried prestige. The machinery still worked. But the person at the center of it all, the girl who would inherit everything, had already learned to equate affection with obligation and attention with survival. The empire was stable. The heir was not. And when Barbara finally stepped into society as a woman with unimaginable wealth, the dynasty would learn, far too late, that no fortune, no matter how vast, can compensate for a childhood spent unprotected. By the time Barbara Hutton became a woman, the world had already decided who she was supposed to be. She was introduced to society not as a person, but as a phenomenon. Newspapers tracked her movements with obsessive precision. Her gowns were described in inches of silk and dollars of diamonds. Every public appearance was framed as evidence that the Woolworth fortune had produced its most exquisite creation. But behind closed doors, Barbara was unraveling. She had grown up surrounded by adults who managed her wealth flawlessly and her emotions not at all. As a result, she entered adulthood with an enormous fortune and no internal defenses. She was shy, painfully sensitive, and chronically uncertain of her own worth. Attention overwhelmed her. Solitude frightened her. And love, when it appeared, felt like oxygen. Barbara wanted what money could not buy: safety, devotion, permanence. Instead, she learned quickly that her wealth distorted every relationship she touched. Men did not approach her carefully. They approached her strategically. Friends admired her possessions before they understood her personality. Even strangers felt entitled to opinions about her body, her choices, her future. Inside the empire, Barbara felt smaller every year. She struggled with her health, both physical and emotional. Anxiety followed her constantly. Eating disorders, exhaustion, and recurring illnesses began to shape her daily life. But these were treated as inconveniences, things to be managed discreetly so they would not interfere with public appearances. What she truly suffered from was invisibility. The Woolworth name opened every door, yet it erased her individuality. She was never simply Barbara. She was the heiress. Every desire was questioned, every decision scrutinized. Even her loneliness was interpreted as eccentricity. So when affection appeared, intense, immediate, intoxicating, she clung to it. Her first marriage was not just a romantic choice. It was an escape attempt, a belief that by binding herself to another person, she might finally escape the isolation that money had built around her. But the dynamic was already familiar. Power imbalance, dependency, control disguised as care. Love, for Barbara, came wrapped in obligation. Each relationship reinforced the same lesson. The men who entered her life did not fall in love with her vulnerability. They exploited it. Some sought status. Others sought financial access. A few sought both. And Barbara, desperate to be chosen for herself, repeatedly mistook attention for devotion. The empire watched from a distance, disapproving but detached. Advisors whispered. Lawyers intervened selectively, but no one stepped in decisively. Not to protect her heart, not to teach her how to say no. Old money prides itself on restraint, on emotional discipline, on knowing when to walk away. Barbara was never taught those skills. Instead, she was taught to endure, to apologize, to believe that suffering was the price of affection. And with each choice she made to feel less alone, she drifted further away from the stability her fortune was meant to guarantee. The empire still glittered around her, jewels, estates, invitations without end. But inside, the woman at its center was exhausted, fragile, and dangerously hopeful. And soon, that hope would cost her far more than anyone expected. Wealth did not destroy Barbara Hutton all at once. It eroded her slowly, through permissions she never learned to deny. By the time the cracks became visible, the damage was already structural. Each marriage promised rescue and delivered control. Husbands arrived with charm, titles, or artistic reputations and left with access to bank accounts, properties, influence. Love was always urgent. Finances were always temporary. And Barbara, conditioned to equate giving with being valued, rarely questioned the arrangement until it was irreversible. Money flowed outward in quiet, devastating streams. Jewels disappeared first, then estates, then liquidity. Advisors framed each sale as necessary, each concession as strategic. But the pattern was unmistakable. Every emotional bond came with a financial hemorrhage attached. Barbara was not reckless by nature, she was permissive. And permissiveness, at her scale of wealth, was catastrophic. Behind the scenes, her health worsened. Chronic illness, exhaustion, and dependency on medication began to define her days. Doctors treated symptoms, not causes. Friends noticed the decline but learned not to interfere. In her world, concern was impolite unless invited, and Barbara rarely invited it. She smiled through pain. She hosted through fatigue. She absorbed disappointment without protest. This was not resilience, it was conditioning. Publicly, the image remained intact. She was still photographed in couture, still seated among royalty, still described as glamorous, eccentric, tragic in a romantic sense. But privately, her empire was collapsing inward. The most dangerous rot was not financial. It was psychological. Barbara had learned to distrust herself. Every decision felt suspect. Every instinct second-guessed. When advisors warned her, she suspected manipulation. When they reassured her, she feared abandonment. There was no stable ground from which to act, only reaction. And predators recognize instability instantly. They framed exploitation as protection. They labeled control as love. They encouraged isolation while presenting themselves as the only safe presence in her life. And Barbara, exhausted and unwell, accepted the narrative because the alternative, being alone, felt unbearable. The Woolworth fortune had been designed to survive wars, depressions, and generational transitions. What it was never designed to survive was intimacy without boundaries. By the time reality intruded, in the form of mounting debts, shrinking income, and dwindling options, Barbara was already physically weakened and emotionally depleted. The gold was still visible, but it was hollowed out from within. And when the illusion finally failed, it did so quietly. No headlines announced the collapse. No scandalous exposé captured the moment. Just a series of small, irreversible losses, each one normalized until there was nothing left to normalize. What followed was not drama. It was disappearance. Barbara Hutton did not fall in a single moment. She faded. There was no public reckoning, no spectacular scandal to satisfy the newspapers that had once chronicled her every move. The world simply stopped watching. Invitations slowed, then stopped. Familiar faces disappeared. The rooms that once echoed with music and conversation grew quiet. The assets went first. Estates were sold under the language of necessity. Jewelry that had once symbolized permanence was quietly liquidated. Each sale was explained away as temporary, prudent, reversible. But nothing ever came back. What had once been abundance narrowed into maintenance, then survival. Her marriages ended not with fury, but with exhaustion. By this stage, Barbara no longer expected rescue. Love had proven unreliable. Partnership had proven conditional. What remained was endurance, a skill she had perfected since childhood. She adapted to smaller spaces, fewer staff, diminished presence. She learned to live without spectacle. The social world adjusted easily to her absence. High society, which thrives on novelty and relevance, has little patience for decline. Without wealth to circulate or glamour to project, Barbara became inconvenient. She was not shunned dramatically. She was simply forgotten. And forgetting, in elite circles, is the final form of rejection. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Years of stress, medication, and emotional neglect converged. The body that had carried unimaginable pressure for decades began to fail. There were hospital stays, recoveries that never fully arrived, and a persistent sense that time was no longer something she controlled. By the end, Barbara lived quietly, far removed from the empire that had defined her name. The girl once labeled the richest in the world now navigated life with limited means and minimal support. Not destitute by ordinary standards, but stripped of the security she had been promised since birth. And then, in 1979, Barbara Hutton died. There was no grand funeral befitting her legacy, no procession of dignitaries, no spectacle to mark the passing of a woman who had once embodied excess itself. What remained of her fortune amounted to a fraction of what she had inherited, a sum that shocked those who still remembered what her name once meant. Her death did not make headlines the way her debut had. It passed quietly, almost politely, as if the world had already said goodbye long before her body did. The fall of Barbara Hutton was not violent. It was gradual, and by the time it was complete, there was almost nothing left to mourn. After Barbara Hutton was gone, what remained was not outrage. It was quiet. No scandals resurfaced to demand re-examination. No heirs stepped forward to reclaim her name. The Woolworth dynasty continued in fragments, its legacy preserved in buildings, archives, and footnotes, not in people. Barbara's story settled into history as a curiosity, a cautionary tale softened by distance. She became a nickname again, the poor little rich girl. In museums, her jewels are admired without context. In biographies, her marriages are listed like statistics, In photographs, she appears composed, luminous, untouched by the weight she carried for decades. The image survives far better than the truth. What is rarely remembered is how thoroughly she was unprotected. Barbara Hutton did not fail because she lacked intelligence or generosity. She failed because she was never taught the most essential rule of old money, that survival requires boundaries. Wealth demands discipline, power demands restraint, and love without limits becomes extraction. Her fortune was large enough to attract everyone, and structured in a way that protected no one at its center. In the end, she left behind no school of thought, no foundation that reshaped the world, no dynasty that bore her imprint. What she left instead was an absence, a lingering question about how someone with every material advantage could be allowed to live so exposed, so alone. History often frames women like Barbara as tragic romantics, as cautionary figures undone by emotion. But that framing misses the deeper truth. Her life was not a series of personal failures. It was a systemic one, a failure of guardianship, a failure of education, a failure of those who believed money alone could substitute for care. Old money prides itself on continuity. Barbara Hutton represents the cost of breaking it. Her silence now is complete. No interviews, no defenses, no revisions, only the echo of a life lived under constant observation and constant misunderstanding. Old money leaves behind buildings, names, and endowments. But when it neglects the human being inside the fortune, it leaves something else behind, a void. And that void, unlike wealth, never replenishes itself. If you're drawn to stories where luxury conceals its most devastating consequences, this is where they live.